In this video, we're going to go over a little bit more about the basics of warping inside of Ableton. In the last video, we took a drum break and we set it up so that it would play in time with the rest of the loops in the session. This time what we're going to take a look at is an acapella, and I'll be using this to show you some of the other features that you can use inside of this sample editor underneath the warp section. If you're not familiar with what an acapella is, it's just when you remove the vocals from a song and that's all you're left with is the vocals from the track. Now if you look at the audio file, you'll see that Ableton has only given it one warp marker, and there are a bunch of these gray little triangles throughout the whole song. So it's placed little markers where it thinks all of the transients are, so that way it's trying to make this acapella fit in time with this global tempo that we have at 120. So it's trying to make this fit, but it's not quite there. And I'll play it for you just so you can hear. I'll start it a little bit closer. So now if you listen, and I'll play it with a metronome.
If it's a little blurry how the whole thing started, I don't.
So it sounds really choppy and it sounds really off beat. So what we're going to do is we're going to get this to where it lines up with everything. So the first thing I'll do is I'll zoom in and I'll find that initial downbeat, or that first kind of note within the lyrics. So it sounds like she's right here saying it's. So Ableton thought that this right here is where the downbeat should be. But if I play it, it sounds like it's more like right around this mark. So what I can do is I can hold shift and I can drag this over. So now it'll start there. And then the next thing I'll do is I'll right click and I'll set 1-1 here. So now that's just going to guarantee that this will start as the downbeat for this acapella.
If it's a little blurry how the whole thing started,
Now if you've listened to this song, she actually starts off beat and not on beat. But for now, we'll just start with it on the beat and then we can move it later. And a lot of times what I'll do is I'll bring in the actual song if I'm trying to warp an acapella, and I'll bring in the actual song and then I'll find out where these words fit within that 1 bar frame where it's like where you have the downbeat and then a beat 2 and 3 and 4. And then I'll find out where these words sit and then I'll warp it along with the actual song. But this song is pretty straightforward in the rhythmic pattern of it, so it'll be pretty easy to warp. So I can already go over to this other waveform right here, and I can double click and add a warp marker there. I know that's the start of another phrase. So if I play this again.
If it's a little blurry how the whole thing started, I don't need.
Alright, so we can drag that onto the 3, and then I'll zoom in and I'll make sure that it starts where it's supposed to. So I'll hold shift and I'll drag this over a little bit. And then we'll listen to that again.
If it's a little blurry how the whole thing started, I don't even really.
And sometimes to make this even easier, what I'll do is I can take a look at this section called seg BPM. It's segment BPM. And what it's telling me is that if I click on this warp marker, it's telling me that the tempo between this warp marker and the next warp marker is 155.59. And if I click on this warp marker, it's telling me that the average tempo between this warp marker and the next one is 153. So I'll just take that information and I'll plug it into the tempo, the global tempo. So I can type in 155. And now if I play this back, it should sound a lot less choppy.
It's a little blurry how the whole thing started, I don't even really.
So you can hear that it smooths it out. It's still a little bit choppy, but not as bad as it was before. And part of that is this other section where you see we have it set to beats. So there are different warp modes that you can be in. You can be in beats, tones, texture, repitch, complex, and complex pro. And each one of those will vary the sound a little bit because it's applying a different algorithm. So it's going to change the way that Ableton is trying to process this audio and makes it sound different. And I'll explain each one of those a little bit better so you can understand how they work. Before I get into each one of the warp modes though, I want to get this so that it's on beat. And all I have to do now is, because we have this first kind of downbeat and we have it leading up to this next downbeat and we know that this is kind of one phrase, what I'll do now is I'll move this start bar just a little bit over, about half a beat or so. I'll move it over to this next transient And then if I listen to this, we'll see it should be on beat.
It's a little blurry how the whole thing started. I don't even really know what you intended. Thought that you were cute and
So that sounds a lot better as far as being on beat. So now what we can do is we can start to work with that, and I'll show you the different warp modes that we have. One thing that we'll do really quickly is we will just right click on this second warp marker and we'll go warp from here, so that way we can get the rest of this song closer to being on beat, because it trails off the beat a little bit as it plays on a little bit longer. So now you'll see that if we zoom out, Ableton has added in some extra warp markers and has tried to kind of put it on the beat. And so if we play this from the start, we'll listen to what it sounds like in the beats mode.
it's a little blurry how the whole thing started. I don't even
And I'll turn off the metronome so that way we can pay closer attention to the actual lyrics.
It's a little blurry how the whole thing started. I don't even really know what you intended. Thought that you were cute.
So it sounds pretty good, but if I try to take this back down to that house tempo that we were at, say 120, then you'll hear that it starts to get really, really choppy.
It's a little blurry how the whole thing started. I don't even really need.
So beats mode is kind of more for rhythmic elements like drums and percussion. And so if we want to do something like vocals, we can use any one of these other ones, but they all do something slightly different. Tones is better for monophonic sounds like bass lines, where it's just one note playing at a time. Maybe it says for vocals, but I don't tend to use it for vocals too much. But it depends on what you're trying to use it for. So if you're trying to use it to get the smoothest, kind of cleanest possible sound, then tones might not work too well for the vocals. Let's try it and play around with it.
It's a little blurry how the whole thing started. I don't even really know what.
So it sounds a little grainy. It sounds like more choppy than the beats, but in a different way. So you can play with the grain size in order to try and smooth it out a bit.
It's a little blurry how the whole thing started. I don't even really know what you intended. Thought that you.
So you see, as we go down in the grain size, it gets a little bit more robotic, but as we go up in the grain size, it actually smooths it out a little bit, not completely, but it smooths it out a lot better. And then we can go to texture. Texture is kind of what the name infers. It's more for like pads and textural kind of sounds, where it's these long, elongated kind of noises where it doesn't have necessarily a set rhythmic kind of pattern to it. And again, you have these other options you can play with, such as grain size and flux. Grain size is just doing the same things as it did with tone, where it's just changing the algorithm in a way where it's just changing the length of the way that it's sampling the notes. So as you play this, I'll zoom in really far. So imagine if, as this is playing, Ableton takes a small loop chunk of each section and then kind of tries to blend it together, each one of these little loops, in order to smooth out the sound. So what you're doing with grain size is you're adjusting the size of that, so that way it takes smaller chunks or bigger chunks, so you can make it sound more grainy by going smaller. So it's essentially what it's doing is, if I zoom in, it's taking a smaller loop chunk. So it's taking this smaller piece, and then it's taking this next smaller piece and this next, and that's where it gets more grainy sounding, because it's jumping through and grabbing these smaller loops. Or if you take it up in grain size, then it's going to be taking a kind of larger chunks, and it's able to smooth it a little bit better. So we'll see what this sounds like. If I hit delete, it'll set it back to the default grain size. So we'll just see what this sounds like on texture with the default.
It's a little blurry how the whole thing started. I don't even.
So it still sounds a little bit robot-y. It sounds a little bit tinny. I'll play around with the grain size so you can hear.
It's a little blurry how the whole thing started. I don't even really know what you intended. Thought that you were cute and you could make me jealous. Put it down.
So you heard as we got really, really low as possible, it sounded almost distorted, like it sounded very, very digital. And then as we went way up, it actually almost had this doubling effect, which is kind of cool. So you can use these you can use these different warp modes for different kind of feels depending on the kind of sounds that you're going for. And then flux is actually just adding in some variation and some randomness to all of this. So the higher you go with flux, the more random it is with the way it's kind of sampling and changing the audio as you go through it. So I'll hit play and just adjust some of the parameters with that.
It's a little blurry how the whole thing started. I don't even really know what you intended. Thought that you were cute and you could make me jealous. Poured it down, so I poured it down.
So yeah, texture, you can really have some fun with that one and play around with the different settings in there. The next one is Repitch. And Repitch is just like turntables. So I have turntables and I have old vinyl records, and when I put the vinyl records onto this turntable, there is a pitch adjustment knob. And if I slide that pitch adjustment slider to the positive values, then it pitches the notes up, and that's where you get these like squirrely kind of chipmunky sounding like vocals, or it starts to make everything sound very sped up. Or you can take that pitch adjustment slider and slide it all the way into the negative values, and you start to get this much slower, pitch down, kind of chopped and screwed kind of vibe. And so with Repitch, you see that there's no other options for you to kind of adjust anything, because all it's doing is, as we play with the global tempo, it's going to make this sound slower or faster. So I'll play this for you in Repitch, and because we took this and we slowed it way down from its original tempo, it'll sound very, very slow.
It's a little blurry how the whole thing started.
Now what I'll do is I'll start to speed it up so you can hear how it's changing as we use Repitch.
It's a little blurry how the whole thing
started. I don't even really know what you intended. Thought that you were cute and you could make me jealous. Poured it down, so I poured it down. Next thing that I know, I'm in a hotel with you.
You were talking deep like it was mad love to you.
So I'll reset that. And that's just using Repitch, so you can really have some fun with that as well. The next one is Complex, and there's also Complex Pro. Now, if you have Ableton Intro or Ableton Lite, you won't have access to Complex or Complex Pro, but I'll show you how they work because they're actually really awesome if you want to have something that's a lot more clear, and you want something that it doesn't have all those artifacts in it. And by artifacts, what I mean is, if I go to Beats and I play this,
it's a little blurry how
you hear how it's very choppy. And then when I was in texture mode, if I took the grain size way down, it sounds very like robotic. Those are the artifacts. Those are the digital artifacts that Ableton are putting in there to make the sounds sound a certain way. Sometimes you don't want that. You want the best possible sound, and you want it to sound very clear, so you can use Complex and Complex Pro. So I'll play this, and we're keeping it at 120. So that's the BPMs. We'll keep it right there. And it should sound as close to what it did at the original tempo of 155.
It's a little blurry how the whole thing started. I don't even really.
And what I'll do is I'll change this to 155 as it's playing, so you can hear how the vocal performance doesn't really change. So it keeps it as close to the original as possible as you start to change the tempos. And granted, if you try to go too far, there's limits to some of this stuff, but you can really start to test those limits if you'd like to.
It's a little blurry how the whole thing started. I don't even really know what you intended. Thought that you were cute and you could make me jealous. Poured it down, so I poured it down. Next thing that I know, I'm in a hotel with you. You were talking deep like it was mad love to you. You wanted my heart, but I just liked your tattoos. Poured it down, so I poured it down.
So you can see as we got faster, it didn't sound chipmunky and it didn't sound very sped up. It sounded faster, but the vocals didn't change pitch. And then as I got really slow with it, I took it down to 100. It still didn't have as much of the artifacts. So it still sounded like the original performance. So Complex works really well for that. And then you also have Complex Pro. So I'll change this back to 120 and we'll start with Complex Pro next. Now, Complex Pro offers you a couple of extra things that you can play around with, the formants and the envelope. Formants only really become useful when you are transposing the audio, and by transposing, you're just pitching it up and down. So if I play this, I can transpose it as well.
It's a little blurry how the whole thing started. I don't even really know what you intended.
So you can really start to play around with transposition and start to do some fun stuff with the audio that way. Now, one thing I'll point out is if I play this audio in Complex Pro and I play it in just Complex, it's actually going to sound slightly different too.
It's a little blurry how the whole thing started. I don't even really know what you intended. Thought that you were cute and you could make.
So it's a very, very minute difference that maybe you can't tell, but it sounds a little bit more grainy in Complex Pro, and sometimes I have kind of like, it sounds a little phasey in Complex Pro, but I think that's partly because of the formants and the envelopes, because you're introducing two other factors that you're able to manipulate. So Complex Pro is really good. I like to use Complex Pro whenever I'm trying to really manipulate the audio, if I want to transpose it or if I want to make it sound chopped and screwed. You know, if I want to start manipulating the audio and start to try and change it up a lot, then Complex Pro kind of works better for that because you have more things that you can play with. And I'll show you that. So we can take and we'll transpose this down an octave. So we'll go down 12 semitones. And if we play it back now, it'll sound slower.
It's a little blurry how the whole thing started.
And it's funny because it has it like Stephen Hawking kind of sound to it. But that's an interesting use of it. You could take that sound and get this very computerized kind of sound, or you can play with the formants and start to get a different sound.
It's a little blurry how the whole
Things started. I don't even really know what you intended. Thought that you were cute and you could make me jealous. Put it down.
So you see how it kind of smooths out the performance, so it doesn't sound as computerized. It sounds a lot smoother this way. So now you can get this pitched down, kind of chopped and screwed vibe by changing the formants and transposing. And then if we take it in the opposite direction, we can see what we get that way. So I'll click on this triangle, reset it, and then we'll take it up to 12 semitones above, and then we'll change the formants back to 100.
It's a little blurry how the whole thing started. I don't even really know what you intended. Thought that you were cute and you could make me.
So if you're going for like Alvin and the Chipmunks, then maybe that's a good way to play with it. The last thing I'll play around with is this envelope feature. And Ableton says that the best setting is 128 in order to get the smoothest sound, but now we can start to adjust this and see what kind of sounds we can get out of it by playing with this envelope feature now that we have played around with the transpose and the formants. So lower envelope values should give you kind of a smoother sound. And then the higher one, you could hear that it gets a little bit more grainy or a little bit more robotic and kind of tinny sounding again. So then we'll take this back down to 12 below and we'll try that chopped and screwed kind of vibe. And we'll play around with this envelope again.
It's a little blurry how the whole thing started. I don't even really know what you intended. Thought that you were.
So some of this stuff gets really funny to me when I'm listening to it. But so as you take the envelopes all the way down, it definitely sounds smoother again. But as you take it all the way up, it sounds like somebody who has been chain smoking for the last 20 or 30 years and has a hard time talking. But so all of these things are just very different effects. So you can really start to play around with it and get some really different effects. It doesn't just have to be on vocals. I just happen to be using that with I just happen to be using vocals or an acapella for this example, but you can apply these different warp modes to any instrument that you want. You could do it to drums, you could do it to bass, you can do it to synths, you can use it for any effect sounds, pads, you name it. So you can play around with these different warp modes, and now that you understand how to actually warp inside of Ableton, you can start to use these to your advantage and test them out and try to stretch things as far as you can or compress them as much as you can and get some different sounds out of it. Or if you're trying to go for a very clean sound, you want the original sound, if maybe you're trying to do a remix of, let's say, this song, then you can toss it into complex mode, or you can go into Complex Pro and just keep the formants and envelopes where they're at, and then take the transpose up. Unless you want to transpose it, then I would say definitely take advantage of using the formants and the envelopes to kind of get a smoother performance out of the vocals. So that is the warping feature inside of Ableton and the different warp modes that you have access to. So play around with those and see what kind of cool stuff you can come up with. I also left in this other acapella that I didn't go through and warp yet because I wanted to leave you something in case you wanted to play around with this. So we have the Ellie Goulding one and the Humpty break that we already gone through, and so there's this other one, Faith Evans, and so you can go through and try and warp this for yourself and play around with these different warp modes.